Well, welcome everyone. I do have 1:30 Eastern time on my clock, so 12:30 Central time. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the first North Central Integrated Pest Management Center's Pests and Progress webinar. I am Lene Jess. I'm one of the co-directors for the North Central IPM Center. And we are one of 4 regional IPM centers that are supported by the USDA National Institutes of Food and Agriculture through the Crop Protection and Pest Management Grants Program and the Regional Coordination Program part of that. We have a mission to coordinate IPM across regions, and we are starting this series because the PDs for the Crop Protection and Pest Management Grants Program are required to hold a PD meeting. And so we're trying to do it this way since COVID is not allowing us to do it in person this last year and this year. So we thank Dr. Rob Morrison for being kind of our guinea pig for doing this, the first one that we have. These will be held every 3rd Wednesday of the month at the same time. I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, since this is a Zoom webinar, you'll have to either type them in the Q&A or you can use the raise hand feature, which are located usually on the bottom of your Zoom panel. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So we have Dr. Rob Morrison, who's a research entomologist at USDA ARS for the Center for Grain and Animal Health Research in Manhattan, Kansas. Rob's talk is Diversifying IPM After Harvest, the Promise of Implementing Insecticide Netting to Protect Stored Products. And I will be putting some links for his research in the chat, so you can look for those as we go along. If you have questions, you can go ahead and type them, like I said, in the Q&A area, and Rob will try to kind of watch those and answer as he goes, or if it makes more sense to wait to the end, we'll do that also. But you'll have opportunity for questions. So I'd like to welcome Rob, and thank you for doing this for us, Rob, and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, I appreciate that introduction. I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit about our project, particularly using long-lasting insecticide netting to help diversify IPM programs for protecting commodities after harvest. So here's my outline for the talk today. I'm going to give just a little bit of background about stored products, what those entail. I'll talk about what we've done with the insecticide netting, how we've assessed it at food facilities. I'll talk about some of our outputs, developing some fact sheets, developing an online repository for stored products. I'll also talk about some of the work we've been involved in on tech transfer and interest and adoption on the netting, and then end with some accomplishments for the project. So just a little bit of background. Stored products represent a large sector of the agricultural economy. So just grain storage for corn, soybean, and wheat alone represent a value of almost $86 billion in the US. And so if we think about our crop in the field, it's going to get harvested, and then it goes through this series of storage, transportation, processing, and marketing. And that includes all these different contexts. So that could be storage on farm, in grain silos, transportation in semis, cargo ships or trains, to offsite warehouses or to processors or elevators, marketing at retailers, and then oftentimes it ends up in our own kitchens for end users. And at every point along each of these links, we can get infestation by a variety of stored product insects. And so every year we lose between 2 to 10% of our harvested crops just through this chain from the farm to the consumer, all of it completely preventable. And worldwide, post-harvest losses are estimated to exceed $100 billion annually. In total, there have been over 1,600 species that have been associated with post-harvest products, and 70 of these represent economically significant species. And I've kind of just given a representative sampling of a species here on this slide. And so historically, stored product insects have been managed with a combination of 2 fumigants, methyl bromide and phosphine. Methyl bromide has been mostly phased out of use in the US because it was designated an ozone depleting compound by the Montreal Protocol. but phosphine is still widely used, but there are increasing challenges with its use. In particular, there's been a dramatic rise in resistance to phosphine by 8 species worldwide, including here in the Great Plains in the US. There's also been an increasing demand by consumers for organic and low insecticide inputs throughout the supply chain. And many of the fumigants that used to be on the market, say in the 90s and 80s, are no longer used or available to do a variety of safety and environmental regulations. And so that really highlights that we need to preserve the efficacy of our remaining fumigant tools. And one way to do that is to incorporate new technologies to make sure that we use those fumigants as a tactic of last resort. And so when we think about our food facilities, insects there's 2 main ways for insects to move around. One way is through human-mediated dispersal. And so we can think about commodities being received by a facility and commodities already have a pre-existing infestation. And so that would be an example of insects being moved by humans. But we can also get landscape dispersal by insects. And that happens because these food facilities are giving off lots of odor cues, food cues that are attractive to insects. And these stored product insects can disperse many miles, and they have hosts in the landscape. And so they will readily fly and immigrate into facilities, causing new infestations. And so one way to potentially intercept these immigrating insects is to use these long-lasting insecticide nets. These have been successfully used as bed nets to reduce the spread of malaria in Africa, and more recently, they've been used in pre-harvest agriculture. Now, the benefit of these nets are that they confine insecticide use to the net and away from the commodity. And so they could be used to cover vents or eaves and openings in and around facilities, or to partition different parts of the facility internally to prevent insect movement. They have potential multi-year efficacy, and they've been very promising in preliminary studies. The netting we've been looking at is produced by Vestergaard. It's a 0.4% deltamethrin incorporated net, and we've been testing it compared to net without the insecticide, but identical in every other physical attribute. So you can see the 2 kinds of nets here. They're pretty much indistinguishable. We've tested the nets now against a variety of species. I'm showing 4 species here, but we've actually tested the nets against 8 species, including, among others, red flower beetle, capra beetle, lesser grain borer, rice weevil, warehouse beetle, maize weevil, others. But if we think about our species in the net, if we look closely here, here's red flower beetle. You can see that the net isn't actually a physical barrier. And so this highlights an important point. So if we're a food facility and say we want to maybe cover these vents here with a net to protect a commodity inside the facility, we can think of a couple scenarios here with immigrating insects. In one scenario, an insect might contact that net, but they may still be sufficiently able to get to the commodity, lay eggs, produce progeny, and create an infestation, in which case we'll have said that that net failed in being able to protect the commodity. In another scenario, the insect, again, contacts the netting, but it could be that their movement and dispersal is so significantly impaired that they're not able to get to the commodity, in which case we'll have said that that was successful in preventing infestation. So actually their movement and dispersal is a key variable here to look at in this system. And so we had some essential questions. One was whether the netting is repellent. So again, it does incorporate a pyrethroid, deltamethrin, and pyrethroids have been described anecdotally as repellent to other insect species, not our species. So we wanted to make sure that the nets wouldn't repel our insects. We wanted to assess whether brief exposures resulted in decreased movement, whether contact prevented dispersal to novel food patches, whether exposure eventually resulted in death, and whether multiple brief exposures has the same effect as a single longer exposure. And that's important because when you think about how exposure will happen, you can think about the insect, maybe climbing up, getting exposed, falling down from the net, but maybe climbing back up because there's some attractive food cues and getting dosed multiply that way. And so do those shorter exposures have the same effect as a single longer exposure time? And so we found that actually the netting is not repellent to any of the species we've tested, and we tested again about 8. We found that brief exposure to just one minute to the netting resulted in a 2 to 3-fold decrease in movement. That was both immediate as well as long lasting over the course of a week. We found that dispersal to novel food patches was reduced by 95 to 100%, depending on the species that we evaluated. And I have a little video here just to demonstrate how much this affected the behavior of our insects. So this is lesser grain borer here. On the right, you'll see our controls. On the left, you'll see our insecticide netting treated individuals. You see our controls are moving around, happy-go-lucky. Our insecticide netting individuals have no movement whatsoever. So this really has a large impact on their propensity to move around and to disperse. We found that for 5 of 8 of our stored product species, we had 63 to 95% mortality after 7 days after a 5-minute exposure to the netting. So that was very encouraging. And we found that multiple brief exposures, so three 30-second exposures was the same as having a longer 3-minute exposure. So that was very encouraging in terms of having those multiple exposures basically have the same effect as a single larger one. We also did some follow-up work in pilot scale warehouses to see whether the netting can prevent dispersal and progeny production in a commodity at the far end of a warehouse if we release a bunch of insects. And so here we were releasing 100 warehouse beetle, red flower beetle, and lesser grain borer on 12 different dates. And so we released insects on one end of the warehouse. On the other end, we put a mixture of a wheat and flour commodity and then gave the insects 72 hours to disperse. And we had a few different treatments where we deployed the insecticide netting in a few different ways to mimic different ways that it might be deployed at a food facility. In one way that we termed a pipe deployment, we had a PVC pipe that we cut in half and had it bisected by just a single layer of the netting, released insects on one end, allowed them to disperse through to mimic sort of a vent deployment of the netting. We had a hanging deployment where we bisected a whole warehouse with just a hanging layer of the net to mimic a partition inside a facility. We had a cover treatment to mimic that went directly around the commodity to mimic a pallet deployment. So around like some goods or a commodity in a warehouse. And then we had a control where there was no netting whatsoever. And so here's how those treatments looked. The pipe on the right hanging in the middle and then the pallet on the left. What we found is that regardless of how the netting was deployed, we had basically a 95 to 93% reduction in the number of insects reaching that commodity when the warehouses had the insecticide netting there. And so you see the warehouses with insecticide netting in red, and then our control there on the left in the black. So very successful. Even more successful in preventing progeny production. So even fewer of those individuals were able to produce offspring. Very, very few. Basically 99% of the offspring were produced in the control. We also assessed the residual effectiveness of the netting at monthly intervals over 24 months for sites that were exposed on a southern facing wall in a sheltered area, but not temperature controlled, and then compared it to sort of laboratory out of the box netting. And basically found over 12 months kind of full efficacy for the exposed site, and then over 14 months of efficacy for the sheltered site. By the end of the period, we tested 2 species, red flower beetle and lesser grain borer. At the end of the 24 months, after a 10-minute exposure, the lesser grain borer, 98% were affected when exposed to the insecticide netting, and 64% of the red flower beetle were affected after 4 hours. So again, fairly effective and long lasting. So in the future, sorry about that. In the future, we'll be assessing other active ingredients to diversify options and reduce pest infestation, and evaluating with other pest management tactics, and then determining whether the netting can become clogged with food dust. We also did some work looking at the net as a kill mechanism in a trap to intercept insects on the perimeter of facilities as an additional layer of protection. And so this gets to sort of a premise of attract and kill, whereby we're releasing some broad spectrum volatiles to bring in a diverse group of insects, and then removing those individuals from the foraging population. And so in deploying these kinds of traps, again, we want to deploy those on the perimeter of a facility. And so we have data for this from Kansas and Arkansas from 2 years, deployed on a weekly basis, 2 days at a time. And here's what our exploded view of our trap looks like. We have a base with either insecticide netting or control netting on the top and bottom, PVC pipe with a grain kind of caramel trap. And then we added a broad spectrum attractant or deployed it without that. So in total, we had 4 combinations: control netting or insecticide netting, with or without attractant. And when we look at the mean number of insects captured, obviously the ones with our attractant captured a far greater number of insects than ones without the attractant. Importantly, the insecticide netting did not hamper the collection of insects, so that was encouraging. And then when we took that grain back and reared out progeny after 6 weeks, we found that the insecticide netting significantly reduced the amount of progeny produced, suggesting that basically insects that are captured in that trap are killed, meaning that it's an effective kill mechanism. So that was very encouraging. And then we also captured a diverse community of insects. So in total, we caught 3,000 individuals from 13 taxa, a lot of dermestids, a lot of lesser grain borer, a lot of other species. So very successful kind of proof of concept that could be layered on again in a sort of IPM multiple hurdle strategy to protecting food facilities. So in the future with this, we'd want to weatherize the trap better to decrease maintenance, deploy kind of a non-commodity refuge, but retain those pheromones, and then determine facility level response to those new lures and traps. All right, so from this project, we've been able to develop some nice outputs, including a series of 3 fact sheets. And so for these fact sheets, we had, for each side, we had a kind of common sheet that had a project overview with some kind of the main stats about the project team, project overview. And then they each focused on the other side on either the behavioral effects, the direct mortality, or the deployment strategies for the netting. And so those are now going through their external round of review, and then will be available to stakeholders and on our the PostHarvest.info site that link that was sent out to you folks earlier at the beginning of this session. And I just wanted to highlight that online resource. So typically in the past, these outputs from stored product projects have gotten lost kind of through the cracks, and there's not a lot of them online. And so we've been trying to compile them and add more as we go along in a central location. And so that's the goal of this postharvestinfo.com, kind of a new clearinghouse of information for stored product related information, everything after harvest. So if you know of new resources or you would like to see certain kinds of resources on there, there is contact information there for our team. Feel free to use those links. We are compiling fact sheets, bulletins, recommendations. We've been taking photos of key stored product insects and damage that are downloadable, beginning to put some outreach and extension videos on there with stored products and related topics, as well as media coverage and some other topics. So, again, check back frequently. It's kind of a work in progress at the moment, and we keep getting more content there. So again, that's postharvestinfo.com. And finally, just a little bit about some of the tech transfer and engagement with industry. So far with this project, we've reached out to over 600 grain handlers, pesticide applicators, agents, and food facility managers. We've had one-on-one meetings with the IOAM Science Steering Committee. That's the International Association of Operative Millers. We've had other meetings with industry stakeholders, and again, have had those other outreach outputs. We've also worked closely with Vestergaard and the netting distributor AgBio to provide data that has allowed them to expand the EPA label for the netting to include post-harvest environments and pests. And so that was approved in June of 2019. So that was a success for the project. And at the last 3 stakeholder meetings with an attendance of 170, the stakeholders were polled and asked, are you interested in adopting insecticide netting for your food facility after a presentation on it? And 97% replied yes. So there is very robust interest in adopting this netting. And finally, just some numbers with the project. There have been 13 peer-reviewed publications, and there's some more in progress. There's been 15 other kinds of publications, including reports, proceedings, fact sheets, 94 talks, including 32 significant invitations, including the international meetings, 14 symposia organized for a combined attendance of 720. The students that have been mentored on this project have won first or second place finishes in student competitions. And total 16 staff have been trained, including 2 postdocs, a PhD student, master's student, and 11 undergrads. And there have been 11 or over 10 other awards won, including for myself, a couple Excellence in Early Career Awards from the Entomological Society of America and from the Oilseeds NC 213 group. So just a few take-home points. You know, there are challenges to fumigation, but innovations in IPM are helping to solve some of these. And insecticide netting is a promising new strategy to help diversify IPM and stored products. So with that, I'd like to thank the whole team, including the project director, Kunyan Zhu, Rachel Wilkins, who was the master's student that collected a lot of the data for these projects, Savita Ranabat, who's the current PhD student working on this project, our collaborators at Arkansas State University, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Kansas State University, other scientists at the USDA, and of course, all of you for your attention today. Thank you very much. And I can go ahead and see if there have been any questions that have been asked. I haven't really been able to take a look yet.
All right, thank you so much, Rob. That was very informative. I know when I was an extension agent, it was always hard to find information for post-harvest pests. So I'm glad you have that website up there now. So if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand, click the little raise hand button and we'll let you talk, or you can type them into the Q&A. I have a couple of questions that have come up so far, Rob. The first one is, how does the long-lasting insecticide netting factor into phosphine resistance management programs at food facilities?
Sure, yeah, so that's actually a project that the Savita Ranabat, my current PhD student, has been working on, and she has been working with both phosphine resistant and susceptible populations of lesser grain borer and red flower beetle, and has found that actually the netting is equally effective against both types of insects. And so that really indicates that it may be a way to deal with some of those resistant populations. And that's actually relatively an important point. And I have a few slides here. So so here's where we're at here, kind of in the North Central area. And just in Kansas, where I'm at, there 50 to 93% of lesser grain borer populations and important stored product pests are resistant to phosphine. And in my county alone, 48 to 77% of populations are resistant to phosphine. So this is kind of an important point. And and so we're now doing some follow-up work to see, if we deploy this kind of at a scale, like at a field scale level, can we decrease the number of fumigations that happen? Can we delay when they have, the timing and so forth? So we're doing some follow-up work now on that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question was, how will the netting work with existing management strategies at food facilities?
So that's a good question. That's another topic that we're working on. And so we just got another CPPM grant funded to look at how we can best combine the netting with aerosols, with the use of aerosols, residual contact insecticides, and using different active ingredients to achieve the best control. And we found that from some of our preliminary data that when you use different active ingredients, it's sort of like a double sieve, and you can get added control above and beyond what you would with either tactic, alone. And so, I think the the preliminary data that we have is favorable that when we use these nets in concert with a holistic IPM program, that we will get favorable outcomes for protection of these commodities. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then I had a question on, you talked about it like grain facilities that you were putting the netting over the air intakes, that type of thing. But if I was a food facility, where would I deploy the netting at? What areas?
Oh yeah. So food facility. I've been using. Sorry, I should have defined this. I've been using food facility as a general term for any sort of post-harvest facility. Although anything from a grain handling facility, processing facility to like a restaurant or like a grocery store, like anything like that. So basically, there's a number of ways that it could be deployed. Depending on the type of facility that you are. So like if we think in terms, so are you asking like more so in terms like closer to the consumer? Like, is that the question or?
I think it was just in general at a food facility where the netting would be placed.
Okay, generally speaking, you could deploy them along vents, on eaves. Some facilities have windows and doors and so forth. You could do it along the edges of those. You can do it. Inside facilities, there's often like internal partitions. You can do it along those to help minimize dispersal within the facility, which can be actually significant. You can do it. Around pallets on shelves where shelving is. You could do it as a layer on the bottom of the shelf, so that when insects land on that shelf, that they're basically affected. So things like that. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Is there a certain distance that you have to be away from the food product, or can it be pretty close to it?
Well, so again, that'll depend on like the kind of setting that you're in. So like if we're talking about a warehouse where things are packaged, like you probably could be closer because that packaging, will separate the commodity from from potentially being in contact with the netting. But if you're talking about kind of bulk storage of grain, then obviously you have to be a little bit more careful, and probably you'd want to stay kind of on the outside of any like grain bin or whatever. You want to put anything on the inside or where it would potentially be in contact with the material or with the commodity. So. All
right, thank you. And then I have one more question. And so again, others, if you have one, you can either raise your hand or type it into the Q&A. But won't systematic deployment of netting promote insecticide resistance development at facilities, or how's that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, obviously overuse of any tactic isn't great. And so the way we envision netting wouldn't be just you only use netting and nothing else. Like the way we envision it being used is as part of a comprehensive IPM program. And so in that context, it's just one part of many parts. And when you have those parts working together, you'll have a variety of different active ingredients, in different parts of the facility, deployed in different ways that will help prevent the development of resistance and so forth. And so I think it will be less of a problem, the development of resistance, if we're talking about the development of resistance for deltamethrin specifically. And some of the work that we're doing now for the netting, developing other active ingredients to incorporate in the netting, I think will also help ameliorate some of that by providing additional options that could be used to kind of rotate out. So maybe like 1 year, you use deltamethrin, maybe another year, maybe you use indoxacarb or something, one of the other compounds that we're testing. So that might be an option for the future. So.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions or hands raised. I'll give people a couple minutes, and while we're waiting, I want to thank you again, Rob. That was a great presentation, and it sounds like you've gotten a lot of outputs from that, so that's great. And it sounds like your work's still continuing with another grant. So I just want to remind everybody that our next Pests and Progress webinar will be held on Wednesday, April 21st at 1:30 Eastern and 12:30 Central. And that will be given by Rufus Isaacs from Michigan State University. And the title of that one will be When Invasive Pests Disrupt IPM, Responding to Gall Wasp Outbreak in High Bush Blueberries. You can see our upcoming webinars and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that at ncipmc.org. And on that website, you can also find, there'll be some abstracts of upcoming talks there. And then if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, which is called The Central Issue, you can also find that at ncipmc.org.